Welcome to this episode of In Conversation With. My name is Rajiv Ramchandra, and I'm the founder and director of Recreate. As you know, here at Recreate, our primary focus is to catalyze and advance the remanufacturing industry with a specific focus on India. This work is multifaceted and involves collaboration, research, education, advocacy, and the bringing together of stakeholders to coalesce around a shared vision representing shared values. This is where a process or an approach like road mapping comes into the picture. Road mapping is a visual, structured, and flexible approach that helps organizations and industries understand where they are now, where they want to be, and how to get there through the creation of a plan. To learn more, we connected with Dr. Rob Phaal from the Institute for Manufacturing at the University of Cambridge. Rob is the Director of Research at the Center for Technology Management and conducts research in the area of strategic technology and innovation management. He has over 2 decades of experience in the application of road mapping and has worked with organizations across a range of sectors, including automotive, aviation, biotech, electronics, healthcare, robotics, and utilities. He has given keynotes, conducted workshops, and delivered customized training courses to companies, governments, and universities in countries around the world, including Austria, Denmark, Hong Kong, India, Japan, the UK, and the US. Please join me in welcoming Rob. So to start off with, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, the Institute for Manufacturing, and what got you interested in road mapping?
Sure. I've got a mechanical engineering background. I keep on finding people with that background in road mapping. I'm not quite sure why. But I did my PhD in computational mechanics and then a technical job for a few years, consulting and contract research in structural integrity, fracture fatigue. And I was looking for something interesting to do, and I stumbled across a little advert in the local paper for a 1-year secondment into technology management, and it kind of fascinated me. I didn't know what that meant. So I started that and really enjoyed it. So I'm still there 23 years later, back in the university within the Institute for Manufacturing. And what's great there, it's a vision of engineering, industrial engineering, basically. And it really appealed to me the fact that industry was our laboratory, and we're sort of hacking academia in a way. And I do think that leads to better quality academic research because it's anchored in real industrial situations. And it was only because of that extensive industrial interaction that we spotted road mapping quite early from an academic perspective. There were a couple of other groups in the States as well, but it had been around in industry for a number of decades, actually. And one of my colleagues, David Probert, who was working with a firm in Europe, and they were a member of a club in Europe where they share experience, and called IRMA, European Industries Research Management Association. And they had a working group, number 52, on road mapping. And he was helping them with a student project to write up the report, and stumbled across it. So it's a serendipitous find, totally enabled by extensive time spent in industry. And I'd encourage academics to do more of that, really. And so he built it into a sort of a proposal for some research. And it took me about a second once I saw it to think that's a very interesting tool. And so I'm still working on it. It's a fascinating method, very practical, but lots of interesting conceptual ideas behind it, very flexible. And so we've been working over the years on a number of aspects. Firstly, it was perceived at the time to be a sort of big company solution. So we thought, well, why should it be? You know, can we lightweight it to make it more accessible to smaller firms? And sort of agile approaches, or how you'd call it today. And what we find, of course, is big firms like that too, because it's the first step on what can be a journey, and you can always make it bigger, but making it small can be a challenge. So it's often used in a problem-solving mode initially. And what we're finding now, it's really interesting from an integration point of view. So in strategy and innovation, you have to bring a lot of things together. And road mapping is a very powerful tool for integration and communication. And the integration of toolkits is important because every management method has strengths and weaknesses, and you need to combine them together for a strong toolkit. And road mapping serves a special role in that integration purpose. So we're looking at other things too, the visual aspects and so on, but it's proved a very long, interesting research strand with a lot of industrial impact.
Yeah, no, that's great. I was doing a little bit of research beforehand, learning about road mapping a little bit on my own, and there are those sort of 6 key questions that are used to go down the path of road mapping. Essentially, it's where are we now, where do we want to go, and how do we get there is what you're trying to go through as a process. And you've got this amazing CV and body of work. You worked with organizations from around the world. So clearly there's value and perceived value and actual value being gotten by virtue of using this tool. So could you sort of walk us through a little bit of what that process looks like and how it helps companies?
Sure, and I think you've highlighted a key point there, that at that fundamental level, it's a totally generic tool. It's often called technology road mapping because of its origins in high-tech sectors, but actually totally generic tool that can be applied in non-technical environments too, because it does speak to some fundamental questions we all have to think about from a strategic perspective. I mean, firstly, it's important to separate out the roadmap from road mapping as a process. A roadmap is a structured visual representation of strategy. It's actually a very simple tool in concept, but it helps you see complicated problems. And sometimes people blame the tool for causing that, but that complexity sits in the system. And if you can't see it, you struggle to manage it. So it's firstly this visualization structured, so it's got a sort of systems thinking behind it. But it's often said, I've heard in industry that people say the process of road mapping is more valuable than the artifact produced, because it's about bringing all of the key stakeholders together that have to develop a common understanding and aligned actions to succeed, to create the roadmap. And that process is incredibly helpful for building consensus and communication. And people's fingerprints on the roadmap means that it can actually be a real thing, not just a piece of paper or filed away in a filing cabinet. So we need to think about the benefits of the process, but also the benefits of the tool. And if, as I said earlier, all tools have strengths and weaknesses. So the strengths of road mapping are integration and communication. And of course, those are very valuable to organizations of all types. And so that's really, I guess, the key benefits, but they're usually focusing on wanting, to build confidence and consensus around the decisions they need to make. And so that's the goal. But in order to get there, you have to deal with these integration and communication issues. As not a very analytical tool, usually you need other tools and so on to build the evidence base to give people that confidence. So road mapping alone would have some weaknesses there. We always combine it with some other methods.
Okay, yeah, that's great. That's really helpful to know. And as I understand it, road mapping, this is something that's strategic, and also you're looking at creating an outcome, not necessarily as the artifact of the roadmap, but the visualization process and getting all the stakeholders together and coalescing around something like a shared vision is over an extended period of time, right? So you're looking at it over maybe 5, 10, 15 years, that kind of time frame.
Yes, part of that structure is by convention, although different representations are possible, time must be an explicit dimension for it to be. And it is a futures technique historically. It does tend to want to set direction with the longer term so that you can be confident your next steps are coherent with that pathway to value. Because looking at the future is, of course, uncertain. You'll get it wrong, but the output of any iteration is confidence and consensus about what we do tomorrow. And if people are confident that's a step towards value, you learn more and you update the roadmap. So it's not like an ordnance survey map or a sat nav. It's more like a combination of an explorer's sketch map, because the future is uncertain, and a battle plan. What do we do next? Right. And if people always remember that the purpose of the road mapping is not to create the artifact, but to influence action, then it can become a very living document. And also it's worth thinking about the past, because if we've got a timeline and we're in a continuum from the past to the future, it's a fantastic learning tool if it's applied to the past. So, for example, in a company, before they think about their next innovation, it can be a very efficient learning process to capture the experience from a previous innovation, so the strengths and weaknesses can be brought to bear in the future. So I think of it often now as a roadmap as a sort of knowledge hub. Every time you get together to crystallize all your thinking, it all comes together on the roadmap. And then it detects the actions for the next step, and then you come back and you resynthesize, and then you have a flexible navigational tool.
Got it. So a quick follow-up question, and then if you could share maybe an example of a road mapping project, possibly one that involved a diverse set of stakeholders, ranging from industry, government, that would really be helpful to kind of cement our understanding here. The very quick follow-up question that I had was, what's the frequency with which one goes back to update it, as a living document?
Yeah, and that links partly to the time dimension that's appropriate. So it's all about the rate of change in the system. So, and often that will come from all sorts of different parts of the system operate at different clock speeds. Technology has its own pace, ranging maybe from the fastest being software, where long term for software might be a year or two. But if you're building new materials or infrastructure or aerospace systems, you'll be into decades. So part of the update speed would be linked to that rate of change.
Got it.
And the cycle time has to fit, of course. So in a software system, it has to be very efficient. And then when events change, you may need to update the roadmap. So a pandemic might arrive, and that would be a good time to update the roadmap. Or often people align it with the decision points in their firm, which would be aligned with that rate of change. So stage gates in innovation, new product processes, or annual strategy review cycles where budgets are aligned. If you don't link it, it's a service to those processes, road mapping. So if you don't link it to the decisions and budget allocation, it's not going to have a lot of impact on the organization.
Yep, that makes sense.
In terms of some examples, I think your point about stakeholder richness is key, because in any real situation, there are often lots of stakeholders that somehow have to cooperate, and if they're misalignments, information asymmetries, that's all inefficiency of getting to the future. It slows you down. So even within a relatively small firm, you might find the complexity of those different perceptions and alignment it can be challenging. So just actually, rather than just one example, maybe just three small illustrations of showing how diverse stakeholder views can be brought together and how flexible the tool is. Just a recent example, some colleagues of mine have been working with Cancer Research UK and looking at early diagnosis and treatment of cancer. Clearly diverse stakeholders involved, from hospitals and even patient groups and so on, and scientists. And what's interesting for me there, it's a recent example, you can find it on the internet, is that it's an illustration of how these methods propagate through sectors. So it initially emerged from the manufacturing sector, and then when it goes into something like healthcare, of course, that's quite a big leap, and people will be wary of a manufacturing tool. And I've seen it ripple out through all sorts of sectors, and you have to be able to see the sort of more general approach and then adapt it and then configure it. Otherwise, it won't fit. And usually find sort of lead organizations, and then other people in that sector will see it in their terms, and it'll smooth adaptation. So that's one example, which is not about one firm. It's at the sectoral level, bringing all of those stakeholders together. It can be really a huge number. Once you have the roadmap itself, then you can communicate to people who weren't involved in the creation of the first roadmap. I've done just one quick other little healthcare example. I did the first time I got involved in healthcare was with Great St Albans Street Hospital years ago, Children's Hospital in London. And their task was to, how do you convert the research needs in that area to fundraising messages, to communicate to the public about the importance of the research. And so that was really interesting to have the sort of scientists, the very senior doctors, and also people representing the public and so on, and how we translate the language into a more accessible form. Mm-hmm. Another interesting example was at a very large European research program, just illustrating how this systems thinking is really powerful for bringing very diverse communities together. This was called a system of systems problem, where they're looking at very diverse groups to try to understand how what commonalities they might have. And it was multi-site manufacturing was one, multimodal traffic control, emergency and crisis management, and distributed energy production. Now, normally they would just go into each of their groups and sort it out, different language, different priorities. But if you actually try to find the common language, which a systems thinking can bring, you can start to look across those domains and find the commonalities where maybe you could leverage capabilities from one area into a need of another. And that was a really interesting demonstration of that power at a very top level to be able to integrate and align diverse areas. And perhaps the last little one, most interesting in a way, is, does a doctor take his own medicine? And so to see academic applications starting to pop up, often very different culture, different organizations and industry. And if you adapt the technique to suit that culture, it can be very effective because everyone needs strategy. So within the University of Cambridge and some other academic institutions, I've seen an interest in, adapting these techniques to apply for university strategy across the whole of the university here, actually. And you have, it's not about directed strategy because academics have a lot of freedom. So it has to focus on emergent strategy as the dominant logic. And if you find what everyone wants to do and bring it into this common space, you can find common purpose. And when you've identified that people with a lot of autonomy have a common purpose, then you get a natural collaboration appearing. In that case, it was all about, common, everyone needs funding, everyone is dealing with infrastructure and those sort of things, so facilities. So we could make sure we had a common language across the whole university and find those common things that sort of naturally emerge, because top down is a little bit less effective here.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what I find most fascinating with road mapping is how broadly you can apply it, even in areas that, like you said, although the genesis was in high tech and more sort of manufacturing related, but from the standpoint of the visualization of what a common shared vision and reality could look like, and then having some kind of framework that brings those disparate voices together to then craft something that's meaningful to everybody, as opposed to working in silos, which I think there's a
and that's a universal need. So, yeah. I mean, that's been an ongoing research interest because there's no shortage of tools, but out there, and in fact, too many, they're proliferated all the time, and lots of speciation and instances of these tools. So, an interest of mine from road mapping and also some other related tools like portfolio methods and so on is to find the abstract generic form in all of these instances, and then you can learn how to configure it for those instances. People often mistake an instance of a tool they see as the generic form, and then they might naively try to take it and apply it in their own situation and find it doesn't quite fit.
Right.
And so it does take a bit of experience, I guess, to see all that variety. And we've actively looked for it because our hypothesis at the beginning was this is a generic tool. And so we were looking for diversity in application to develop the experience to find the generic form.
Got it. In that, so just sort of staying to the realm of examples, is there a particular road mapping project or experience that you thought was unique or something that was unexpected, or in terms of either industry or application, that really sticks out for you?
Yeah, I've got two little examples here, and they're not ours. So because we don't own all knowledge on road mapping and so on, and we learn a lot from other people. It'd be hard not to mention, I think, the most impactful technology roadmap ever is the driven semiconductor development for 3 decades. And people often aspire to the international technology roadmap for semiconductors but nobody else has achieved it. So there's something unique about the semiconductor industry in terms of the scale of the investments that competitors have effectively collaborated to create a standard to accelerate the whole sector. So the only reason why we've got these supercomputers in our pockets is because of many decades of really a lot of hardware-based innovation. And so since the early 1990s, sector has basically kept this roadmap updated continuously, which is quite rare because they find it useful. And that has, their market drive in a way was Moore's law. How do we sustain the pace of investment, because they knew it's such a platform technology. So that's all in the public domain, which is great. So sector level examples are usually out there because they want to influence. What's quite invisible in the internet is all the company level initiatives, because they're very confidential normally. So people may mistake the tool as a sector level foresight tool, when really all of this activity at the firm level is a bit opaque. So that one's always worth mentioning as a sort of gold standard. The other one I'll just mention now, I saw recently, you mentioned earlier in our discussion, UNIDO, the United Nations Industry Development Organization, which has been active at providing support for industrialization and development around the world, and have provided training and tools. And I've done some training for them years ago. So once the pandemic hit, around May, I was kind of interested to see what are people doing with road mapping in response to COVID. And there you can find perhaps one way of thinking about it is the short-term response type roadmaps to mid-term to long-term, different parts of a portfolio really. And the one I spotted I really liked was from UNIDO for the short term. And it wasn't an actual completed roadmap, it was a template, which is sort of other people could put in their own data into. And it was for about how do you rapidly repurpose equipment. Infrastructure in response to a crisis. And I thought it was pretty amazing they could produce that so quickly as a tool to help people with this emergency situation. And of course, any other kind of emergency situation, this kind of template approach might be useful. So people might want to, if you just search that on the internet, you'll be able to find that example. And I think that's a great one. It's very well structured. It's a nice template. And I think I anticipate that might have had quite a big impact on people's response to COVID.
Yeah, no, that's great to know, because it's funny you mentioned UNIDO and also the repurposing aspect of things, because that's in the same wheelhouse that Recreate is working in, is trying to catalyze and advance remanufacturing. And one of the things that's on our radar right now is in the healthcare space, and looking at where repurposing medical devices and equipment fits into this COVID response, and what role it might have to play in emerging countries or developing markets like India. So I'm definitely going to...
Sort of incremental roadmaps, probably the day-to-day bread and butter roadmaps, but actually transformative, kind of when there's a big delta, big change, there's a different type of roadmap. And that's really important for the big challenges we face, in even short-term responding to crisis, but also, other looming crisis like climate change and the need to adapt to that. So a different style of roadmap from the incremental type is needed for these big challenges.
Yep. No, thank you. This is good. So this has been helpful, because I came into this with the misconception that the outcome, which is the roadmap document, is static, but it's not. It's something that evolves as you're getting feedback, and data points change, and perceptions might change, and choices might influence, and therefore the roadmap needs to evolve.
Static roadmap is a dangerous thing, and one has to. It's easily mistaken for Gantt charts and so on, and it's not. A roadmap will have a longer time horizon and a much broader scope. So the output of a road mapping iteration will be projects, and of course Gantt charts are suitable for that. But if people mistake the two because they look somewhat similar, then it can easily become a fixed long-term plan, or mistaken as such. And then it will be a very efficient way of doing a lot of harm. And so people need to make sure it's not perceived like that, and also visually doesn't get easily mistaken for that.
Yeah. And so in my misconception, my question was going to be, how do the outcomes or the actions taken by virtue of a roadmap compare to the roadmap? But it sounds like because there is iteration and feedback, that delta, you're trying to keep that delta as narrow as possible. But do you have any thoughts or examples where either there is much deviation, or how much can be expected?
So a very common question, but normally I immediately pick up on this discussion we've had about it's not about a fixed term plan. Nobody's got a crystal ball in their pocket. Your assumptions about the future, and you may take a scenario based approach, will be wrong. So it is important to keep it as a dynamic navigational aid. And linked to that, people have often asked, have you looked back at old roadmaps to see how accurate they were? And I say, well, I'm not interested in accuracy of forecasts because I know they're wrong. And in fact, that's a misconception because it's more about how often do you update it. And of course, you do the best you can about the future, but it's inherently unknowable. So we need to confront that and accept that, and then you can manage it. It's a way you need risk management techniques to deal with that. And agile approaches is one approach because you're not committing to a very long plan. You're taking the first step and then reassessing. So it's no, I don't think anyone's really done that research, but actually it'd be kind of pointless because it's just the question is how accurate is our crystal ball. It'll be accurate over the short term, and then you'll get error bars and so on. And but just what you need to look more at, I think, is what's the impact of the roadmap. And I mean, just one little story perhaps to illustrate that. One of the most interesting applications I was involved in was looking at a whole corporation in a day and a half of one iteration with a very large group of commercial and technical managers, about 65. And it was a $10 billion business. So very quick run through the whole system. And because we had everyone there, we could look for things that often fall between the cracks, which are things that this company could only exploit because of they have capabilities in different parts of their business that could be combined between divisions. And because we're doing it together, we could hunt for opportunities which were specific to divisions, but also ones that were possible by collaboration between the divisions. And so this is a very quick cycle, about 3 months before their annual strategy process, so they could prepare for that. But they did identify interesting opportunities, and I heard subsequently that at least 3 of them became businesses in their own right. Just by being able to bring those different perspectives together very efficiently. Things can happen, there's no guarantee, but being able to track those impacts over time is very important, of course, because people are investing in a method and they want to see, are there benefits? But those benefits usually lie in the process. By bringing people together, you get interesting actions rather than the accuracy of the forecast at any one time.
Very good. So I want to be mindful of time here. And so I have kind of a last question to close on. For those of us that are sort of at the beginning stages of either considering road mapping or want to look at this more seriously, what preparatory work would you consider to be necessary or vital so that the journey of road mapping is one that you would call successful?
I think the first key point I would make is to adopt an agile approach. I met somebody from Philips who are very influential in road mapping in the 1990s, who said you should think big but act small, because people can see the promise for road mapping to synchronize things and solve all sorts of problems, but actually that's a journey, and the first step has to generate value. So typically the first step, which can be just a day or two of effort, best focused on a problem or a diagnostic kind of mode. And so you have that longer term goal, but identify a short term problem that you can actually help with. And that will really generate value, get people on board for the longer journey. And also that first iteration is really about what does this tool mean for us? How do we configure it? And so it gives you, so if you approach it that way, it means the risks are quite low for that first step. And then you've got evidence that it's worthwhile, and it's a rather modest investment. If you employ some consultants occasionally to help, they of course are selling hours, and so they may tell you you've got a big problem that needs a big solution. That should be approached always by saying, well, I'll give you a day or two of my time, and then if you can demonstrate value, we're on that journey together. So it's a philosophy of how to approach problems, really, that's most important. But then with that problem in mind, it's really being very clear, what is the focal issue we're trying to resolve? Because there are many problems in the business, and if you don't have a clear focus of what you're trying to do, it can be rather a sort of misdirected initiative. And what is the scope? Who should be involved? How to structure the problem around that focus and scope? And then ultimately, as well as, what is about ownership? Who needs to be involved, that kind of owns the problem or has a stake in it, who needs to be involved to get that buy-in and consensus configured to the particular problem. Often workshops and so on are part of these processes to bring people together. So you only got one chance at that, really. So you want to walk into that with confidence. Quite often we'd have a little design workshop to test out ideas to give that confidence. And the other thing I think should be on the table from the start is it is a visual tool, and putting some effort into the visualizations that you might use for templates and workshops, and also how the roadmap will be used for communication in an effective visual format, has a massive impact on its effect and so on. So I think keeping an eye on that from the start is also a helpful thing.
Yeah, that's great to know. And in the times of COVID, I'm thinking, have you been part of any road mapping exercises in the last few months where, because of travel restrictions and the need for social distancing, has that approach moved into the digital world? And do you find it to be just as effective, or are there nuances and differences?
Yeah, we've historically on the workshops focused on face-to-face, paper and post-it note, and actually very effective, but it's a slightly barrier to experimenting with digital technologies because they're very constrained events and you don't experiment lightly when the output matters. A silver lining of COVID is it's forced us to experiment with that, because companies still needed strategy and online was the only way. And so we had very kind of forgiving partners, if you like. And so I personally haven't done much of that, but I have colleagues who are very active and they've really developed good capabilities. And what they've done is really not try to exactly replicate a face-to-face workshop, it's different, but using standard off-the-shelf commercial tools, a whole set of them, and they're all evolving quickly. Video conferencing software, survey software, digital whiteboard software. They found that you can replicate these processes, but instead of all in one day in a very intensive mode, which you have to do in face-to-face, and it's some benefits to that, what they find is they have to separate out the functions and spread them out a bit. So no more than 2 hours a day, so maybe over a week or two. And that actually, what we found is there's some downsides and upsides and trade-offs basically. And so some things are better and some things aren't so good. For example, if you do separate it out, you can do some work in between and find some more information and so on, which is better. And all sorts of, what I think looking forward to the future, the sort of best solution, if you like, would be a blend of the two, where we understand the trade-offs between the two and when a bit of digital is better and when face-to-face is better. And then we'd have a sort of hybrid models that will be somehow, our design space is, understanding of it is better. My assumption at the moment that all else being equal, it might be best, if possible, to kick off the process face-to-face to build trust. And then I think it'd be rather efficient to carry on that conversation using these digital tools. And they're changing fast as well. So you can't get stuck with any particular one. Right. You've got to keep experimenting. And then I think, of course, digital is moving fast anyway. And now we've got to, I think, as a community in the world, we've got a better chance of being able to get these things blended appropriately.
Yep. Perfect. Well, thank you for taking the time, Rob, to talk to us today and for sharing your insights. Here at Recreate, I know that we're looking forward to kind of exploring how road mapping can be used in some of the work that we're planning going forward. For folks that are watching, if they're interested to learn more about road mapping or even your personal take on road mapping, I'm going to include links to those. I'm pointing below because it's going to be on YouTube and it'll be in the description. So I'm going to put those links up there, and you can learn more about Rob's work, about the IFM, and all the great stuff that they're doing. So thank you again, Rob, and look forward to catching you another time for another chat.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Take care.